NCTA's state-of-the-art theater and to the Broadband Breakfast worldwide audience. It's a pleasure to have you here or have you viewing today. I'm Rick Zimmerman. I'm the Vice President of State and External Affairs at NCTA. For those of you that don't know, NCTA is America's cable industry. We represent America's largest broadband providers that offer fiber-rich networks across the country, offering gig download speeds to 90+% of the country in urban and rural communities. Today, we're excited to have a fantastic program co-sponsoring with our friends at Broadband Breakfast. I'll introduce our host in just a moment. I want to make one aside. We may have some discussion about low-income programs and ACP during the course of today's event. And while we're all hopeful that ACP will be renewed, I did want to remind everyone that all of our providers have some sort of low-income program in place: Comcast Internet Essentials, Spectrum Internet Assist, Cox Connect to Compete, etc. Happy to provide more information about any of those. You can find more information at ncta.com. We will have a blog post up later today about the paper that will be launched this morning. And I know if you go to Broadband Breakfast, you'll also see the paper itself. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Drew Clark, who heads Broadband Breakfast and Broadband Media and a longtime broadband advocate. Drew, take it away. Thank you.
So welcome everyone in person and online. This is a little bit different from our normal pattern, but we are so grateful for our hosts here, NCTA, the Internet and Television Association, for this special event. Just a brief kind of programming note. We are going to go to a presentation. I will introduce the presenter just now for about 15 or 20 minutes. We will take just a few questions from our in-person audience here, but right after that presenter concludes, we will welcome a panel of 6 individuals who will come up here, and we will take questions from the in-person and our live online audience. Thank you to all of you who are joining us. If you're watching on any of our channels besides Zoom, we ask you to ask questions on Zoom. So there's a login on the page for this event. That's the only place we're going to be taking online questions today, just to alleviate the challenge of multiple platforms. I'll tell a little bit more about some of the future programs that Broadband Breakfast will do. As you all know, we do Broadband Breakfast Live Online every Wednesday, normally at 12 noon. Today it's a little bit early. Again, thank you to our sponsor, NCTA, for working with us on this exciting event. And now to the really exciting part, we're going to hear from a tireless digital equity advocate, Paul Garnett. He's the founder and CEO of Vernonburg Group, a consulting firm based in Savannah, Georgia. Beautiful city, I might say. Paul's firm, the Vernonburg Group, works with large and small corporate international organizations and government clients to close the global broadband gap, with a focus on policy and regulation, as well as access to financing, technical due diligence, program development, and project management. He made a name for himself in many places, but particularly in his 12 years at Microsoft, where he created and led the Airband initiative, leveraging partner-driven approaches to extend broadband access, not just in the US, but globally. And he's got a really interesting global story. But for today, he's going to be presenting a paper called Internet, or Achieving Internet for All. And with that, I'd like to welcome Paul up to present your paper. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It doesn't sound like I have to introduce Vernonburg Group too much after that. So thank you, Drew, for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here with all of you today. For those of you who are in the room, thanks for showing up, and for those of you who are online, thanks for dialing in. So as Drew mentioned, this morning we released a paper focusing on really drilling in on the issue of broadband availability across the U.S. and specifically focusing on socioeconomics, including race and ethnicity and income. And this really kind of builds upon other work we've done over the last couple of years, really beginning with when Congress, through a series of pieces of legislation, created economic stimulus funding focused on closing the broadband gap in the United States. The first two papers that we wrote, which are on the slide on the sort of left side and right side, are focusing on infrastructure programs and helping to advise state and local governments, what this all means, what this is all about, explaining, just a lot of the basics as well as principles around broadband funding and how to set these programs up and run them well. And then last year we did a paper with Deborah Lathan on digital equity, and this is an important distinction. Broadband availability and broadband adoption. So you really can't solve the broadband gap or the digital divide without addressing both the infrastructure problem and the adoption problem. So this third paper that we did last year focusing on digital equity was really all about the availability gap. So in the US today, you have about 7% of households who don't have access to what's now defined as basic broadband, 100 by 20 megabit per second broadband. But you have about 20% of households, even when they have broadband available, they don't sign up for it. And that's what we call the adoption gap. So we did a handbook, again, focused as an audience at state and local broadband offices and other folks who are involved in deciding how federal funds get spent on solving this problem. And then this year, our latest paper, we're kind of circling back on the availability issue and really drilling down on what's going on with availability in the U.S. How does the availability gap on broadband impact different groups differently, and what can we learn from that? What can policymakers learn from that? And also what can broadband providers learn from that as well? Along the way, we've also developed a couple online tools that are also meant to help various different groups better understand these issues. So the first thing we did is create what we call a digital equity map, which basically takes all of the publicly available broadband data in the United States and puts it all into one place, and creates what we think are simple data visualizations, allowing people to use sliders on our site and look at correlation between availability, adoption, demographics, and drill down into their community. So anyone in the U.S. anywhere could look up their hometown and see what's going on from a broadband availability and adoption perspective. And then lastly, we more recently developed what we call broadband funding optimization tool, and it kind of is what it says. I'm not in marketing, so I come up with these names, and oftentimes I wonder, they need someone who does marketing to come up with something that's a little pithier. But this one is also aimed really at state broadband offices as well as those in industry, and really thinking about how we can best optimize the funding that's been made available. And the overall message there is there is unprecedented funding for addressing the broadband availability and adoption gaps. And in our view, there is enough money. It's just a matter of whether states use that money wisely. And if they do, they can both close their broadband availability gaps and have plenty of funding left over for addressing what might be an even more intractable problem, which is the adoption gap. So back over to the paper. So today I'm going to present about 6 slides after this one. One is kind of the high-level observations from the data, and then I'm going to show some data visualizations. There are 5 slides I'm going to show that have different pictures on them. In the paper itself, there are 29 figures and one table. So if you're into data and you like to geek out on stuff like that, there's a lot for you to look at in the paper. But I'm gonna hit the highlights today. And in terms of the data, we really leverage 2 data sets. One is the FCC's broadband data collection, which gives us up-to-date data submitted by all the broadband providers in the U.S. on broadband availability down to the location, so really down to the household. And then we also leverage what's called the American Communities Survey from the U.S. Census Department, that gives us really precise demographic data that sort of helps us then to overlay the availability data with demographics and see what's going on. The FCC's data is available down to the structure or the building or household or home, and the census data is available down to the census block group. So we kind of overlay the two on each other. And a census block is, roughly about 600 to 3,000 people. So in a country of 330 million people, that's a pretty small unit, and gives us a good sense of what's going on. All right, so beginning with the key observations in the paper. So the first observation is, and this is a bit of good news and bad news, right? So overall, there is some good news in the data, and then there's some things we can learn from it and help us to better target our policy interventions and our investments if we're a broadband provider. So the first thing is, if you look at the data overall, and I stress the word overall, we don't see a strong correlation between broadband availability and demographics like race or ethnicity and income. So we look across the sort of main 5 ethnic groups in the U.S., white, Hispanic, Black, Asian, and Native American, and we don't see big differences, at least with 4 of those groups. To the extent that there are differences, a lot of those differences we think can be explained with rurality. So how rural is that population, or where are they living? Are they living in an urban area, or are they living in a rural area? And just back on the data, in terms of rural, we define that as places that have population densities of less than 250 people per square mile. So we think that's a good proxy for rural. We don't want to include, for example, places that are defined as rural but are actually in the middle of towns where you actually do have pockets of population density. So then, sort of moving on to some of the really bad news, which is around Native Americans, and I think many of us who work in the space kind of know this already. But relative to the other 4 groups I just mentioned, Native Americans really have much less access to broadband than any of the other groups. And that really, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about low income or higher income areas where Native Americans live, or rural or urban. In all of those settings, Native Americans have lower access to broadband than the others. And then one other thing just to mention is when all of this is that we looked at, when I say broadband, I'm using the FCC's new definition 120, but we did also look at gigabit speed connectivity as well, because we wanted to make sure that rich people weren't just getting the good stuff and everyone else was getting the slower stuff. And so all of what I just said applies to both of those speed tiers. So we're seeing the same trends. The last sort of high level observation that we make, and this is something we've pointed out in some of the other work we've done, is these are like, think of it as like you're 30,000 feet. So you're looking at sort of national statistics. I mean, again, we have granular data and look at patterns across all of those data sets. But as you sort of come down in terms of your latitude and looking at data from like the 30,000 feet to 10,000 to 1,000, from national to state to local, you do see some nuances and some differences. We call them anomalies. So there are locations that kind of buck the norm, so there may be some communities that are doing really well from a broadband access perspective that you wouldn't expect to be doing quite so well, and then others are doing really poorly. And I think one of the things that we've sort of suggested overall is that we can learn a lot from those places that are doing well, and hopefully use those learnings to help the communities that aren't doing so well. So now I'm going to get into the pictures. So this is the first of 5, and we're gonna kind of drill in a little bit more on kind of some of the things I just said on the previous slide. So just to give you a quick tour of this slide. So and it's the same format you're going to see on some of the other slides as well, except for one that's a bar graph. The rest of them kind of look like this. So on the left side, you have the population that has access to broadband. So from 0 to 100%. And then on the bottom axis, you see poverty levels, basically from 0 to 60% poverty levels. And then on this slide in particular, what we're showing is fixed broadband availability versus poverty levels in all 50 states. And we're looking at it overall, and we're looking at specific technologies. And then we're also looking at what's happened over the last year, because we were interested in seeing if some of the policy interventions that are underway are having a positive effect, and also just overall investment in the industry and bringing connectivity to unserved locations. So what we see overall here is that about 93% of U.S. households have access to broadband. And what we see from left to right on this slide is from low poverty to high poverty, it kind of looks the same. So you have, even in very high poverty areas, roughly the same percentage of people have access to broadband than those folks who are living in very low poverty areas. There's just a slight, 1% difference in those numbers. And then if you drill down and look at this from a technological perspective, so we looked at the three main sort of predominant technologies now that are being used to deliver broadband connectivity: cable, fiber, and fixed wireless. You see with cable, about 87% of Americans have access to cable-based broadband. And again, on cable, you see the same thing. It's kind of the same across from higher income to low income communities. And in fact, if you kind of look at the statistics, cable actually does slightly better in lower income communities than it does in higher income communities. And then I'll skip fiber and just go to fixed wireless quickly. That's about a third of U.S. households have access to fixed wireless. And you see, similar to cable, actually, fixed wireless is available more in lower income areas than it is available in higher income areas. The reverse is true for fiber. So we see that fiber broadband infrastructure is available to about 50%, a little less than 50% of U.S. households. Good news is the number overall is going up with all the fiber investments that are occurring. But what we do see is that fiber is deployed less frequently in places where there are higher rates of poverty than in areas with lower rates of poverty. And I'm going to circle back on that point toward the end of the presentation. So the next one here, again, similar view, broadband availability and poverty. So now we're looking at this from a ethnicity perspective. And again, what we're seeing overall is that you're seeing the same issue, basically that 1% difference overall. And then you look at specific ethnic groups, for just beginning with Hispanic and Black, you see that from higher income to lower income, you don't see much of a difference, all the way to really high poverty areas. A couple here that are kind of curious, like the Asian community, maybe that's an area for us to do some further research on. Part of this might also be the size of the data set. You get down to a very small percentage of that population. But you do see a drop in availability for Asian communities with higher rates of poverty. Likewise, a little bit of a drop for white plurality communities, and then similarly for Native American. And again, I think some of that might also be related to rurality, right? So it could be that some of these populations also are located in rural areas as well, and that might be having a sort of a downward pull on availability to those populations. But I think generally it is an area for further work. The other thing just to mention here is we look at the way that we do this is we look at plurality in a geographic area. So who's the largest group? So these will all be identified as places where, for example, African Americans are the largest group in that census block group or county. If we use that granularity. So and we also, because we wanted to make sure we weren't getting this wrong, we also looked at majority and supermajority, and it basically looks the same. All right, so now we sort of drilling in more on this urban-rural divide, and this is a lot of bars and a lot of bar charts here, but I think the overall message here is if you look at this, and this is from the paper, you spend a little time, sort of going back and forth between the numbers, and what you definitely do see, which is something we all know, there's definitely a big difference between broadband availability in urban and rural areas. And you look at it, all technologies, look at specific technologies as well. And so you see definite differences there, which isn't terribly surprising. So now I'm circling back on the fiber issue. So recall I mentioned earlier that fiber is less available in lower income or higher poverty areas than in lower poverty, higher income areas. So one thing we did in the paper is we decided to take a look at some specific cities across the U.S. and just kind of see what it looks like from a visual perspective. And these visuals are grabbed from our digital equity map. And so this is Chicago. And so what you see here are two maps of Chicago. One on the left is showing cable infrastructure availability, cable broadband availability, and then the one on the right is fiber broadband availability. And the green shades are showing you the percentage of households within the geography who have access to cable broadband. So a darker green color is good. That means 100% of households in that specific tile have access to cable broadband. And then you see a lighter kind of a yellowish, I don't know what that color is, some kind of a yellowish, yellow, kind of greenish color, but those are locations where you have more than 25% of the households living below the poverty line. So again, you see on cable, looks like they've deployed, whoever it is has deployed ubiquitously across the Chicago metropolitan area. There are a couple pockets I see, like airports, where there's no cable broadband. That's probably because there's just, the airport wanted to do something different. But you see that cable's done a good job of deploying across the city. Very different story on the right. So you look on the right, and that's fiber broadband availability in Chicago. And you see basically in downtown Chicago and north and then kind of west into the suburbs, you see pretty good fiber broadband availability. But then as you go south from downtown into the areas that are higher poverty, those places that were above 25% of the poverty level, it's a bit of a wasteland. There isn't a whole lot of cable that's been deployed there. Fiber that's been deployed there. And the other thing in the paper, we also look at that from a racial perspective. And so it's a bit of like a jigsaw puzzle in Chicago. If you look at the neighborhoods in Chicago that are majority African-American or majority Hispanic, they very much coincide with those areas that are high poverty in Chicago as well. So in a place like Chicago, fiber-based infrastructure has not really been deployed in places that are lower income and which also so happen to coincide with the places that are majority African-American and Hispanic. And this has an impact on competition. One of the things we look at in the paper is competition. And what we see is that as poverty rises, there is less access to two or more competitors in the market. And so this would be an example where it's quite possible that some of those areas only have access to one option, and that's not a great outcome. So this is the last visualization I wanted to show you. This kind of wraps it all up. So what you see here again are the same broadband availability and poverty levels axes. Every bubble on that chart is a county in the United States. And every bubble has a color coinciding with which is the plurality population in that county. And they're color coded to the different major ethnic groups. And also the size of the bubble is relative to the size of the population. So larger bubbles mean larger populations. So those will be the large metropolitan statistical areas in the US. And then as the bubble gets smaller down to a dot, we're in kind of really small population counties, very rural areas likely. So what you see again on this chart overall is that there's a lot of cluster at the top, right? And you see that across the ethnic groups and across income, you see that there's a lot of availability. And then what you also see are these dots that are kind of lower down. and they all tend to be kind of the smaller dots. So these are smaller population areas, which, as I said, will tend to be rural areas. And you see a lot of, there's a lot of different colored dots. So it's not just, there are a lot of dots that represent plurality, white counties, but there also are a lot of small dots for pretty much every other ethnic group. And for example, you see quite a lot of Native American plurality county dots, all the way down to the bottom right. And again, the point we made earlier is that there are sort of trends overall, and then there are the anomalies, right? So one of the examples we provided in the paper were two Native American counties, Pima and Apache counties in Arizona. One, Pima doing really well, sort of almost to the top, and very demographically similar from a poverty level, population density level, to Navajo Nation, Apache County at the bottom, which doesn't really have very good access. So you have these situations where you have similarly demographically structured locations where you have very different outcomes. And so the question is, what can those locations that aren't doing so well learn from those that are doing really well? So that wraps up my presentation, and I really appreciate the time. The paper's now available publicly. It's on our website. There's a QR code here on the presentation. You can click through that to get access to it, or just go to our website. I think we have time for a couple questions from the audience who is in the room, and then we're going to be transitioning to a panel with an incredible group of panelists. So maybe I'll just pause for a second and see whether we have any questions in the audience. Don't be shy. Here we go. In the front. And maybe if you could just also say who you are.
Sure. I'm John Yang with AHAC. With respect to the Asian American category, does that include Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Because I think that affects some of the numbers.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Well, why don't we transition? Drew is going to come back up here and get us all set up for the panel. Appreciate the time, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Awesome. We're going to round of applause for Paul. Thank you. All right. And Paul's going to take his place on the panel. I'm going to introduce each of our 5 panelists, and come on up to, for those who are panelists, we invite you to please come on up. Alejandro, would you take the second seat here? Save this one for me. Robert, if you could take the one right there, the third seat. John in the middle, and then Catherine right next to Paul. And I'm going to just say a few words about each of our esteemed panel members. And really this is an exciting opportunity. As I said at the top, we do an event every Wednesday at noon. It's normally an hour. We have an interactive discussion like we're about to have. What we don't normally have is this kind of rich table setting that we've just had from Paul. And obviously, I and the panelists have had a chance to read this and to digest it and think about it. It's most likely that most of you watching or online or here haven't. If you have not yet, I encourage you to really dig deep into it, and go ahead and scan it now so you can ask questions of the audience shortly here. So just from your left to right, we are going to have Alejandra Roark, who is the chief of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau at the Federal Communications Commission. And Alejandro develops and implements the Commission's consumer policies, including disability access. And the Bureau serves as the public face of the Commission through outreach and education, and is responsible for responding to inquiries and complaints, and maintains collaborative partnerships with state, local, and tribal governments. And before joining the FCC, he led a CEO roundtable of national Latino civil rights organizations. I'm sure he'll also speak just a little bit about the digital discrimination proceeding at the FCC and some of the fact finding that the FCC has received as part of that. Next to Alejandro is Robert Branson, who is the president and CEO of the Multicultural Media Telecom and Internet Council. I always get that name wrong since you changed it, Robert. Right? But MMTC is extremely well known, extremely respected, nonpartisan national nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting and preserving equal opportunity in the tech, media, and telecom industries, as well as closing the digital divide on behalf of its members and constituencies. And in his corporate career, most recently, Robert was Associate General Counsel with Verizon Communications and has been president of the Federal Communications Bar Association. Welcome and thank you for being with us, Robert. Next to him is John Yang, who asked that question earlier. So John and I had a chance to chat just briefly before. It's my first time meeting. John, thank you for being here. He is the president and executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, or AAJC. At AAJC, John leads the organization's efforts to fight for civil rights and empower Asian Americans to create a more just America for all through public policy advocacy, education, and litigation. And he has an extensive legal background as well. So thanks for being with us, John. Catherine DeWitt barely needs an introduction, but I will give her one anyway. Catherine is just an incredible force in this field of broadband. She directs Pew Charitable Trust Broadband Access Initiative, which works to accelerate efforts to connect millions of Americans to affordable, reliable, high-speed internet. Before joining Pew, Catherine was associate with Booz Allen Hamilton, where she focused on broadband deployment, organizational management, and public affairs. And again, just have to say another word about the efforts that Catherine and the Pew charitable trusts have been engaged in, really bringing state broadband entities together. But before it was a big thing, right? Now, and Catherine and I share this just a little bit because, I was also what I sometimes call a state broadband officer 1.0, right? In the Biden administration's American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, there was a very small amount, at least it seems small today, but it's 7.2 billion. It seemed large at the time, devoted to broadband infrastructure. And we don't talk as much as we're talking about BEAD, about the lessons that we learned from BTOP and from the State Broadband Initiative. But these were all programs that many of us got our first taste of detailed broadband engagement. And Catherine, again, thank you so much for being with us and contributing your thoughts on this. Paul, we've already introduced, so thanks for being here with us. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and join the group here. So I'm not standing behind the podium. And let me turn first to you, Alejandro. Would you be willing to explain a little bit about what the FCC has been doing on this area of digital discrimination and the task force that I understand you've been leading? Could you speak to that?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for bringing this Power Pack panel together. It's great to start the morning off with so many friends. I wanted to start off by acknowledging that, bridging our country's digital opportunity divide is really and has been a team lift, right? It's taken focused leadership across the federal government, within the private and public sector, and specifically, I think, at the community level, by really engaged partners and the communities that we all call home. So it really is and has been a team lift. I think for the Federal Communications Commission, expanding digital opportunity and promoting digital equity is an agency-wide priority. And part of what I think that has meant in practice is that we've been working really hard to ensure that the internet is fast, open, and fair to everyone. We are working to ensure that our national broadband maps has the most accurate data that we have ever had to really pinpoint where broadband is and broadband isn't. It means that we are bringing new levels of transparency to the internet marketplace through our broadband nutrition labels, which
went live today.
So big shout out to my consumer and policy division, who really did a lot of that work. And I mean, that was a whole kind of process as well. And I think we established new rules to prevent and eliminate digital discrimination. And I think also top of mind for many of us is that we've been working really hard to bridge our country's broadband affordability gap to the Affordable Connectivity Program. So when we think about preventing and eliminating digital discrimination, first of all, it was something that Congress tasked the FCC with achieving, right? I want to make sure that the lawyers are happy, so I want to use the exact word. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure and Jobs Act tasked the FCC to adopt rules to facilitate equal access to broadband internet access. Specifically, I think to prevent digital discrimination of access based on income level, race, ethnicity, color, religion, or national origin, and identify necessary steps for the Commission to take to eliminate such discrimination. Congress further defined the term equal access in Section 60506. My colleague, DeWanna Terry, who actually leads the task force, along with Sanford Williams and myself, really has drilled that section 60506 in my brain as we've kind of been out and about in the world. And so Congress defined the term to mean the equal opportunity to subscribe to an offered service that provides comparable speeds, capacities, latency, and other quality of service metrics in any given area for comparable terms and conditions. So the question always is, how did we achieve that? That big task, and on time, which we all know had some really crazy deadlines, but happy that we accomplished it. So, the chairwoman established the task force to prevent digital discrimination. And part of what let me just give you some bullets. We established a task force to prevent digital discrimination. We also tasked the agencies, Federal Advisory Committee, the CEDC, so the Communications Equity and Diversity Council, to also explore this topic and make their own recommendations, which I know a couple of our colleagues, I know you were definitely on it. It can speak to that work and that process. And if you guys aren't familiar with the CEDC, it really is a great kind of intersection of industry and public interest folks and academics who really, I think, shared their time and talents with the agency to help us establish a framework that would achieve this kind of big mission. And then, from the task force perspective, we really wanted to make sure that we had a very robust record and that we understood the dynamics on the ground. Because oftentimes, when we think about this report, it's a really great kind of analysis of kind of nationwide trends. But we know that oftentimes the reality on the ground, people are facing compounding barriers to both access and adoption. So that for some folks, that the main barrier is affordability. For some folks, sometimes on a neighborhood by neighborhood level, it's not even a community level or a density level. It's this street has this type of service at this price, that street has this type of service at this price, right? So we were really kind of thoughtful of ensuring that we hosted stakeholder roundtables. We hosted listening sessions across the country. John was an AAJC were kind enough to kind of host us in Seattle and brought together quite a few different ANHPI groups to kind of share their perspective about what they're experiencing. And he can speak to some of the things that kind of were surfaced as a part of that roundtable. But we know that it's not just one singular issue that has both stalled broadband deployment in these communities, but adoption is also a core pillar of that, and that you can't kind of isolate them from each other because they all kind of work in tandem. So I'm happy to kind of jump in and provide a lot more context, but I want to make sure that
we'll definitely get into this, and thank you for setting the table. I mean, just one interjection. Paul's paper, of course, is about availability, not a paper about adoption, right? And so that doesn't mean we can't talk about adoption. We can and will, but I mean, that's something Paul underscored, and I think it's really great to have that detailed level. So let's go on and hear a little bit from each of our other panelists. And my first question for you, Robert, is what are the biggest concerns that MMTC confronts in terms of availability? You see me underscoring that. What did you make of Paul's reports, or the Vernonburg reports, because you have two co-authors, conclusions with respect to broadband and race?
Well, first, let me do as Alejandro did. Thank you all for inviting me here. I appreciate this opportunity. Forums like this, we get an opportunity to hear. I get to hear from my colleagues as well as hearing from the audience about what's of concern to you. But when I'm back at the MMTC, my main concern is listening to the people that we work with in our communities. We now have people in many states that we can talk to, listen to. We have brought them to the Hill to talk to members of Congress, to the FCC, to the White House. So we've heard their stories and we've heard their concerns about availability. In other words, they don't want to be left behind when all the money's being put out there. NTIA's got BEAD money going out there. They're making sure that in their communities, they get to be a part of that. And we're working with them, working very closely with NTIA and FCC to educate our people so that they can get on the council working group, whatever it takes to make sure they're in the room to do things. I also, though, I mean, I'm very concerned, and I appreciate the point about rural America, because I'm from rural America. I'm from a little small town in Virginia called Montrose, Northern Neck of Virginia. Last year, when my mother, God rest her soul, was passed on now, but she was sick, I needed to go down there and spend a week with her because everybody else was out of town, and I needed to work at the same time. There's no broadband down there, really. I mean, there is a little bit of service, but down in there, I think they keep talking about they're going to put broadband down there, which would be effective, but so far that was like a year ago, and they still haven't done anything. So that's where I'm really concerned about availability. Is that it's great to look at the national numbers and see what's there, but sometimes you guys bring it home to what you know and the people you know and the concerns you have. And with respect to Paul's paper, I did review it, and I think he makes some interesting conclusions. But I'm gonna be honest with you, I have Dr. Fallon Wilson on my team. She's my numbers person, so I'm gonna talk to her in the next week or two because she knows a lot more about the numbers and slides and things than I do. We will be looking at it, and I'm back on the CEDC. You probably heard that already, and I suspect that this issue might come up there. So I'm also not going to say too much about it, just in case it does, and I don't have to recuse myself at that time.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for giving that perspective, and remember to keep the mic close to your face. And I think it's so interesting to hear about Virginia's Northern Neck. We had an official from that part of the state, the Commonwealth, at one of our previous events, Digital Infrastructure Investment. I do know that there's lots of efforts, and Virginia's got one of the most aggressive and organized broadband offices. So Dr. Tamara Holmes has been doing amazing stuff there. So my first question for John, thank you for being with us and for participating in this special Broadband Breakfast and NCTA event. I want to ask you pretty much the same question. From AAG's perspective, what do you think about, or I should say, what are the biggest concerns about availability that AAJC confronts, and what do you think about the race-focused analysis that Vernonburg Group has gone through?
No, thank you for that. And again, thank you for hosting this and having this conversation. Frankly, thank you for including our community in this, because oftentimes the Asian American community is not included in studies like this. There's a focus, rightly so, on African Americans, Latino Americans. There's oftentimes, not so much in this, but oftentimes in polling, people focus on gender issues, focus on age issues. But then Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders get lumped into the other. And so having a study that sort of has that breakout for Asian Americans is very important to us. And it starts to also dispel some of the model minority myth that sometimes we see. Now, that said, it's interesting because this study, and largely I agree with it, does show that Asian Americans, from the availability perspective, do pretty well. And frankly, that does track what we seem to know in our community. Some finer points on that, and that's why I asked the question to make sure that your study included Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders in the Asian American category. I think where our gaps are when it comes to availability, number one is in the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community. And frankly, part of that is rurality. Because if you're thinking about the Hawaiian Islands, right, number one, if you're thinking about where Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders relocate into Arkansas, into farming communities, in sort of outer parts of California, that would make sense in terms of availability being an issue. The other place where availability an issue, and I think this is borne out by, isn't completely explained by rurality, but is borne out by your statistic on the somewhat precipitous drop when it comes to poverty levels, is the other place that we see availability gaps is in what I might call legacy urban developments. So what I'm talking about here is like the Chinatowns, the Japantowns, where the infrastructure does not lend itself to easy solutions, whether it's broadband, whether it's installing fiber, frankly, whether it's even installing cable at times, it can be difficult. So I think that, and I would appreciate working with you all on thinking about what further studies might make sense. But at least when I look at these statistics, That's what resonates to me in terms of where those availability gaps are. I think the other thing that I would offer is that this is a great start. I'm very curious to sort of have that further discussions, and obviously that's not the focus of this one, on that adoption piece. And the adoption piece, to me, there's two components. One is affordability. Second, I'm going to call adoption as in, are people, even if they can afford it, getting it, right? And that's another place where I think Asian Americans in certain segments of our population are lagging behind.
So this discussion, in some respects, go to Catherine just now, is at least two discussions in one, right? There's a discussion about race. There's a discussion about racial discrimination and discrimination. If there were an income component, we talk about that too, right? But there's also a discussion about rurality, right? And the slide for this event, which we probably should put up here at some point soon, is a rural location, right? Now you can never get everyone you want in the discussion. We did try to get some officials, although, as you point out, Robert, there's a huge kind of Black rural component that is part of this equation too, and we'll certainly talk more about that. But we do these events at Broadband Breakfast every week. We had a discussion on tribal broadband just 3 weeks ago. Huge issue. And again, the Vernonburg Group paper really highlights this and emphasizes, and we obviously don't have any representatives from the tribal community here, but I do want to just flag that point about discrimination and rurality and how those intersect is what I want us to keep talking about. And if I have a lead in for you, Catherine, I want to ask you, how do you think BEAD should be thinking about broadband, race, and rurality together? I know, big question, softball, right?
Just the really easy one to kick off.
Just keep it close to your mouth and
Okay,
it'll
great.
go live. Yeah.
I mean, I'm loud, so, that is a great question. I think before I answer the specific question, actually, no, I'll just jump in. We cannot expect one program to address decades of missteps or flat out failures or low goal setting across labor, economic, industrial, housing, financial, whatever policy area we want to talk about that affects someone's income and their ability to pull themselves up in the world. One program, despite the progress that has been made through BEAD, through the Digital Equity Act, through capital projects, is not going to solve that. So setting that aside, what I will say is that what we have seen over the last few years are federal programs starting to reflect what you and I saw in the states very early on, which were state governments saying, yes, okay, there is progress being made on availability. And I think, as we've all pointed out, the data has and continues to clearly reflect the progress on availability. But what we saw were that states were prioritizing these investments in broadband and focusing on affordable broadband, particularly in communities that were socioeconomically disadvantaged, because they viewed that technology as a tool for economic mobility. So when we're looking at the programs that we are working to implement now, capital projects, BEAD, digital equity, one of the things we don't talk enough about are the 5-year action plans and the digital equity plans that states had to write to qualify for these programs. What we have within those plans, not only, we didn't have any of this 5 years ago, let's be clear about that. So this is a huge step forward, not to mention that we now have 50 states worth of broadband offices and digital equity offices. 56. Thank you. I apologize. Thank you. I know the territories. I know. I'm sorry. I work for Pew. I know. I'm sorry. But yes, 56. And somewhere my entire team just said the exact same thing. But we do have 56 states and territories worth of broadband offices, digital equity staff, and plans for both. And we, with that, not only have a rich data set to understand at a hyper-local level, what are the barriers to availability? What are the barriers to affordable availability? What are the barriers to adoption? But then how are these states and territories planning on incorporating this data, these investments in technology, these investments in skilling? How are they planning on incorporating that into their existing strategies around economic development, workforce development, telehealth expansion? We are at such a pivotal moment where we technology becomes where everybody actually may have that access to that foundational technology that can help lift them up, but it has to be integrated in with these other strategies as well.
Great. And do you want to say something about how you think state broadband offices are thinking about this question of, just again, limiting it to digital discrimination? What, like you just identified the process that these states have gone through in doing these 5-year plans. How, and I'm not just saying digital equity, I'm talking about digital discrimination. How much focus or attention is given to that question?
That's a great question in terms the term itself, digital discrimination. And we haven't run that analysis. And now that you've pointed that out, I'm like, maybe we should add that coding in. And it's a good question. I think one thing that we haven't talked about yet, although we've all kind of hinted at it, the politics of the term digital discrimination. So while a state may not overtly refer to digital equity or digital discrimination, they're still going to talk about aspects of both. Where are the incentives perhaps not in line for a private sector entity to deploy to certain areas, let alone to be able to offer those connections at an affordable rate? Okay, we know that that's not going to work in every community. So how do we structure these incentives, these match requirements, all of the other kind of components that go into making a financial package? How can the state work with their local partners in the private sector in order to, make that math work? I think that but to answer your question, what we're seeing are states focusing on certain segments of the population. So those who have either historically been left behind, whether that's by race, income, or location. So we are seeing, that's how we're seeing states kind of break it out. But as to the question of whether or not they're explicitly targeting digital discrimination, that remains to be seen. We'll do the analysis.
Well, Paul, jump on in.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things that, and I think a lot of times people think of digital equity as an adoption issue, not an availability issue. And one of the things that we've argued for in the papers we've done and the work we've done with clients is, including state broadband offices, is even when you're talking about an availability program, an infrastructure program, it needs to be digital equity by design, right? You have to design digital equity into the program. And examples on that would be, for example, your choice of geographic area for bidding on BEAD or ARPA or whatever the program is. Don't let broadband providers just cherry pick specific locations and then leave the hard ones, off the table. And then you end up with like what happened in Texas recently, where 40% of locations got no bids on the most recent round of programming, on capital projects. And then another example is, for example, in the scoring, you might put points in the scoring for applicants for efforts they take to deploy first to lower income areas or to communities that have traditionally been underrepresented in access to broadband. So it's not necessarily a stick, it's a carrot. It's like, hey, so if you submit a bid and you promise to do X, Y, or Z, you're going to get extra points and you have a better chance of winning that grant and getting the funding.
Please, go ahead.
To put a finer point on it, it's a policy requirement now. It wasn't before. And this is access to all, and that's affordable access to all. And I think that's the initial, whether we call it stick, it's a policy requirement. And then what Paul just outlined is how states are further refining that and how then they are considering their own local market dynamics, their individual priorities as states, and how they're structuring their scoring and their programs to support those objectives. But I think the most important component of this is that we're talking about access for all, affordable access for all. And that's the law of the land pursuant to this funding.
So Paul, you highlighted at the beginning of your presentation, this is a discussion about availability. Could you say something about adoption? And appreciate the need to think about digital equity in both contexts, but is this like the lesser problem? Are we talking today in talking about availability? Are we talking about the lesser problem?
I don't know whether I'd call it the lesser problem. They're both problems. They're a little different. On the adoption side, if you look at and of course, I'm really just telling you what Pew's told everybody. So this is this is me reporting out on what Pew has said. But if you look at the adoption gap, it does disproportionately impact certain groups more than others. So and specifically lower income and certain minority groups like African Americans and Hispanics and folks with lower education levels and older people. So there's a whole bunch of different sort of slices to this on the adoption side, and I think in some ways more complexity to it. So I wouldn't say lesser or more. I think they're both very important, and that's kind of why we did the paper on this paper in particular on availability, because we felt like that also needed some attention. But both are really important, and you shouldn't do one without the other.
I want to come back to a point that Alejandro made earlier, which is that there's often either an actual issue with factual basis or a perception that there's price differences. Okay, now I did not see anything in your paper about price and looking at price by income or by race. But I want to raise the issue of how do we know that there is not, I mean, maybe that's putting the burden on the other way, but how do we know there is not discrimination based or kind of attributable to race based on price in broadband? And Alejandro, since you raised it, I want to see if you have any thoughts on that question.
So I think what I want to acknowledge in this moment is that even with all of these folks that, are intimately on a day-to-day working on this issue, it's really difficult for us to kind of unwind the thread, right? Because they all kind of interact with each other. I think to the point of today's discussion, it is undeniable that, households that live in rural parts of the country are unserved and underserved, right? By the way that Congress has defined it, as in, they usually are paying more for lower speeds. And so that I think is an important component that I just want to acknowledge, lift up, right, as a part of this conversation. And I think when we address the fact that we are all kind of working together, it is a complement between all of these programs, right? The Affordable Connectivity Program,
right.
Which is a program whose success is undeniable. Over 23 million households who are enrolled across the country. And it really, I think, addresses the root cause, the most cited cause that is stalling kind of broadband adoption, which is price. So the success of that program is, again, just undeniable. And we're all kind of hoping that the Congress acknowledges that and recognizes that, and with the hopes that they will extend funding for the program. But I think to your kind of specific question, which I completely forgot, by the way.
It was about differences in the price of broadband by demographic neighborhood, right? Like one type of broadband service being offered at one price, that same service or even a lesser quality service being offered at a higher price to another neighborhood.
And I can echo, what we heard when we were out in the world, so when we had a listening session, I think in Los Angeles, right, along kind of like East Los Angeles area, they definitely, the stakeholders that participated in that, and I think footage of all this is available online, they talk about, like I live here and my neighbor lives here. And whenever I try to buy or shop for internet service, the prices that I get are different. The speeds are different. When we were in Washington with AAJC, similar dynamics kind of bubbled up. And again, I think that what is important about the commission's rules and the conversation that we are having today, oftentimes I think that people get anxious or stressed about liability. Right. But I think that our goal was just to take this moment to establish a shared language and a common meeting point for the conversation, because as we are making this generational investment in extending broadband infrastructure to everyone, everywhere, we want to make sure that we aren't further entrenching the mistakes of the past.
Let's definitely hear from some other panelists. I want to make sure Paul has a chance to respond. Did you consider looking at price?
Yeah, this paper doesn't look at pricing at all. And I don't know about the specific examples you gave. I mean, you always have to sort of marry the qualitative with the quantitative in terms of, your outreach and having conversations with people and what their experiences are. But we have in the context of the adoption focused papers looked at this issue of pricing and thought about what would be affordable for different types of economic situations. And my understanding from the FCC reports is that actually pricing for broadband has been flat or declining over time. This is overall. I mean, again, I can't speak to that specific example you gave. And so I think overall, I think prices for broadband have again been flat or in decline, and that's actually kind of made a very difficult market to operate in as a broadband provider if you can't actually increase your revenues over time. So that is something that we've, you know, that the FCC does regular reporting on.
Robert, please.
Yeah, I just want to ask Paul a quick. When I don't remember it in your paper, but did you, when looking at urban areas, spend any time looking at the MDU question?
No, we did not.
That's
No.
very important. You know, I mean, if you're looking at availability, you can't talk availability without looking at impact. That some people who want to have service can't get service because, you know.
Yeah, that's definitely a known challenge.
I'll make sure.
John,
Yeah,
please.
we didn't cover it in the paper, but definitely it's.
I think part of the challenge with pricing, and one of the things that it would be interesting for, certainly for the Asian American community to understand, is like what goes into that pricing, right? Because you think about it in the housing context, you know that credit scores can affect your mortgage rates. You know that sort of that can affect what you can get, what you can afford. How does that work in this industry, right? Is certain geographies differently priced because of the credit scores, because of the income levels for certain areas? My understanding that generally it is not, but it would be interesting to develop that a little bit further, because I think then we get into the core of this. And I agree, the terminology on this becomes politicized, but I want to find ways to depoliticize it. How do we talk about disparate impacts without suggesting bad intent? The reality is that many of our communities experience disparate impact. But when we say that, we're not saying that someone is purposefully discriminating against us. And we are also saying we need a solution for that, right? So like, how do we talk about that in a real way? You know, when it comes to pricing, when it comes to, again, availability, at least for our community, is not as big of an issue, but certain pockets that will be true. You know, I think it's interesting because, right, if you talk about availability, the capital expenses for that looks very different than when you talk about affordability, that the numbers just look different, right? And then again, for us, when we talk about adoption, like when I talk about adoption, part of that is also language access. The reality is that Asian Americans, 30% of our population is limited English proficient. So how do you make sure that our communities understand what services are available, understand what different programs, whether it's internet essentials or something along those lines, right? Spectrum Assist, that can help our community and take advantage of that. Even ACP, one of the things I know, Alejandro, we worked with the FCC on, was making sure that there was outreach to the Asian American community in language to know about the availability of this program. So those are all the different components, at least for our community, that we're constantly thinking about.
I definitely want to get Paul back into this discussion, but let's make sure we kind of just do a gut check here on all of our panelists. This is kind of, you know, the key point of this report. At a national level, the data do not show significant differences in high-speed broadband availability for any racial or ethnic group except Native Americans. Plurality, majority, and supermajority Asian, Black, Hispanic communities have slightly better access to broadband than plurality, majority, supermajority white communities. And presumably that's because of the higher rurality component of plurality white communities. Paul, did you expect to come up with this finding?
You know, to be honest with you, and actually one of my co-authors is in the audience, Alex. I want to acknowledge Alex is here.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, great job, Alex. I mean, the thing that surprised us actually was on the income piece. And I've worked with dozens of internet service providers over my career and helped them design the business models and go build broadband networks in the US and around the world. And affordability is truthfully an issue that companies look at, and when they're deploying services, look, this is something they look at, right? I mean, just in terms of, you know, can I make a successful business of this? And so going into this, actually, my expectation was that you would see a bigger drop in broadband availability in lower income communities than what we found in the research. It's only 1%. I mean, I was thinking that it would be pretty significant.
Right.
And we were pleasantly surprised that it was not.
Catherine, John, Robert, or Alejandro, I mean, what do you think of this? Have you had a chance to look at it? What are you going to dig into deeper when you have more of a chance?
Well, like I said, at least for the Asian American community, a lot of this resonates, makes sense. I don't doubt that by and large, availability doesn't seem to be a huge issue. I mean, obviously, I do want to dig into numbers. Maybe I'm going to have an offline discussion with you about sort of what aspects of ACS do you use, because we do have concerns with some uses of ACS. But if you're just using it for the demographics, that makes sense,
Yeah.
right?
Mm.
I would be interested in delving more on that sort of that differential that we talked about when it comes to low income, and then delving into more of whether for us, right, it is the rurality component that really is the difference maker, if you will, in terms of availability.
Alejandro, or no,
Catherine,
Robert, please go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm thinking.
You're thinking.
No,
all right.
I actually, I do see it as well to a certain degree. I like to look at Washington DC. Did you look at that specifically? It's an interesting, this community is right here. It's a very interesting community. You because of the cost was probably cheaper to build in Southeast than Georgetown, which still hasn't probably been built out, which is very, very rich and wealthy. So I do see what you're saying there, and probably on a lot of minorities in Georgetown compared to Southeast. But
Just to quickly jump in, what's the level of granularity in your study?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
census block groups.
Okay.
So that would be, typically 600 to 3,000 people are in
So
a
you
census
will get
block.
at least some of that. So
Yeah,
Robert,
yeah.
did
I'm agreeing with him actually. You see that, right? I mean, I'm saying
Yeah.
in certain cities like that, you can look at it. And I think the other issue may be, so I'm not arguing with you on availability. I think the other components are really where we got to take a look at affordability and things of that nature. But availability, like I said, I'm not surprised. Also, I found in my I don't have any scientific evidence, but I've also found that programming seems to have a little bit of an impact. In other words, in many of the communities, they buy HBO and other programming with more so than they would perhaps watching TV in some of the more affluent communities. That's just no way to prove that, but that's what I've noticed over the years. So.
On the adoption side, one of the things we have observed on adoption data is that African Americans punch above their weight in terms of adoption of broadband. So if you look at sort of other things being equal from an income perspective, African Americans are actually a little higher than other groups. Pardon?
Entertainment.
Yeah.
That's what it is. I mean, it's reality. I can't prove it, but that's reality.
Catherine, did you want to say something? You're still thinking.
There's been a lot's been said. I think a few things. First, when it comes to our understanding of affordability, I think we need to press on that a little bit further. First is pointing out the lack of data that we have to really evaluate price across the country, and meaningful data sets on price as it relates to the type of technology that is available. And I would argue in some cases, the age of the infrastructure. But let's put that aside for a second. Actually, no, I won't. Because we actually just released some research on this point, looking at the middle class affordability question. And what we found with the data that is available is that if you, it varies significantly by region. And so I think going back to the point that all of us have been making, this data demonstrates what we know. Deployment's looking good, but we have to get down to a hyper local level and hyper local community level, maybe a building by building, parish by parish, however you want to break it out. We are at the hardest and most expensive part of closing the digital divide.
Right.
And so that means hyper local engagement to understand what the communities themselves need.
And if I may say, it's hard not just in the rural context, but it's hard in the urban context.
Unequivocally.
Right? Yeah.
Unequivocally. I think I'll stop there.
Okay. I've got another question I want to chime in here, and I want to encourage our audience here in person and online. We're starting to get some Q&A. We got a good 20 minutes left, and we want to have plenty of time for questions. But the report, people are beginning to read it already, and I do have a question I wanted to share from the Fiber Broadband Association for Paul here, and it's basically about the study and how you broke down the data. So I had it right handy, but it fell off here. So while I'm trying to get that, could you just speak to why you did the technologies the way you did, 10, 20, any technology 1 gigabit down, fiber, cable, fixed wireless at 100 by 20. Did you look at gigabit symmetrical and just conclude there wasn't really anything to get at there because it was coterminous with fiber 120, or did you find something different from looking at gigabit by gigabit?
So we didn't look at symmetrical. We looked at whether there was gigabit speed connectivity available. Part of the reason for that is just a personal belief I have, which is I think the symmetrical argument is hogwash. And the fact is that people don't consume data symmetrically. They consume data asymmetrically. They're streaming video most of the time. So in terms of the way people actually consume their broadband connectivity, there needs to be a good upstream as well, but it doesn't need to be symmetrical.
Okay.
So that was a more inclusive way of looking at it, is about across different technologies that can provide gigabit speed connectivity. So we didn't look at symmetrical, but if we did, it probably would have actually been even worse for the fiber story. So
Anyway, this is
if we focused on that, then we would have ended up with whatever, less than 50% of households in the U.S. with access to that. And
one point that the Gary Bolton, he emailed me and said that the report fails to highlight that all fiber networks, while the fastest growing wireline technology in U.S. history, are still emerging and today reach only about 1/2 of the households in the United States. Now, you showed some slides there that had some pretty stark differences between cable and fiber networks. How does the point that I've just brought into the discussion impact that, if at all?
Well, actually, I made the point when I did the presentation that less than 50% of U.S. households have access to fiber-based infrastructure. And I also did make the point that the number is actually rising, which is good across all categories: fiber, fixed wireless, cable, all three. Just looking at the last year, we've seen increases, which is great. That's a testament to a lot of the programming that's been happening on broadband. So yeah, I did talk about that, and it's in the paper.
So is there a value to the technology by technology analysis? Or let me just ask, what do you take from that analysis that this report does on that?
I think it's more of an issue of competition than anything. So I think because the reality is 87% of the American population has access to cable already, right? So that's a pretty large amount of the population. And then hopefully that remaining 13% has access to, 7% don't have access to anything in terms of high-speed broadband. And then you have probably that difference is fiber and fixed wireless. So I think there's definitely an important point to make on competition that in fact it shows that fiber has not been deployed ubiquitously across markets. This is not about motivation. I'm not interested in talking about why people do things. I'm just observing about what has actually happened.
Yeah.
And the other thing just to say on this is that our report's a snapshot in time. It's not like predicting the future. So all we're doing is looking at what the data tells us today. When we talk about things like digital discrimination or BEAD program or ARPA, that funding is all about the future, right? It's about what are subgrantees going to do with their funding, or what does a market actor do in their future deployments, even in the absence of access to subsidy. So the question is, what will network operators do in the future? We see what the world looks like today and what has happened in the past. What will change in the future?
Do we have any questions from the audience here in the room? We'll take the microphone to you. We've got one here, so go ahead and please identify yourself.
Hi, Timothy Lee, Center for Individual Freedom. Real quick question with regard to pricing and availability, certainly. The infrastructure bill prohibited price controls. Biden administration officials promised that price controls would not be part of the program. Unfortunately, we're starting to see NCTA insisting on price controls, which may be prohibitive for private broadband companies to expand. Just interested in any reflections you guys might have on that and the problems that might create. Thanks.
Great, thank you for the question.
It's a great question, and it's something that I am getting a lot of incoming right now from folks here, and also a lot of state legislators and offices as well. I think a few things. One, it's regulation of pricing and price setting itself. I'm not a lawyer, unlike everybody else on this panel, I think. So I'm not going to weigh in on the distinction, the legal distinction with that. I do think 2 points. One, ISPs are not required to participate in this program. We want everybody to participate in
But
this
this program you're talking
Sorry,
about.
BEAD. Excuse me. Thank you. We want as many to participate in the program as possible. And that's why, in working with Congress to design the funding structure, we had hoped to see things like difference in match requirements and thinking about flexible funding. We will see how that works out. Interestingly enough, if you haven't read yet some of the draft initial proposals from the states outlining where they were setting or where they were either establishing a benchmark for their low cost option or where they were offering a range, and the data that they provide to back that up, it's fascinating reading. I encourage you to look at that. But I think that this is a great step forward in helping us understand what does affordable look like by state, because it is starting to look very different.
Great. Other questions? We want to get as many as possible. I've got 3 lined up, but we want to give preference to people who came down here. So, Rick.
Sure. Question for Paul. Can you just say a little bit more about rurality? I mean, I think we all think we know what it means, but how are you defining it? And is it a proxy for, the economics of serving a particular area because of density or, harder to blast through rock or whatever the case may be?
Yeah, just one other thing I just wanted to, on the last question, just one thing I neglected to point out is also part of the reason why we looked at different technologies is people get their broadband from different technologies, right? So some people are getting fixed wireless connectivity and some fiber and some cable. That's just the reality of the world we live in. So on the question on rurality, yeah, there are a lot of definitions of what counts as rural across the federal government. Different agencies have different definitions of what that means. For this paper, we actually decided to do a population density proxy for rural because, having been involved in a lot of broadband deployments, that's often the thing that kind of makes something more. When we talk about rural, we're talking about harder to serve or lower population density, lower, higher average cost. So our demarcation for rural and non-rural is 250 people per square mile. And there are other definitions of rural. So I think, one of the definitions sort of encapsulates 66 million Americans. Ours encapsulates 60. So it's kind of close to, numerically to what other definitions arrive at. And we think that using the population density proxy is a better way to do it for this purpose.
Do others have thoughts on this? I mean, this is, again, 2 discussions in one. We probably talked more about the question of race and discrimination, but rurality is another huge issue. And I think, again, Paul, your paper does such a great job of identifying that, breaking it out, analyzing race by urban areas and rural areas. And, for example, Robert, I don't know, does your organization deal with, rural communities and the particular issues of African Americans connecting in rural communities?
We work with anybody who wants to work with us. The short answer, but no, you're right. In rural areas, we do. I'm from a rural area, so if we didn't work with rural areas, I couldn't go home. So
yeah,
so we do. And right now, I'm going to make a point because I don't have so much time. Is that we are planning a Juneteenth program this year, where we're going to have the Black churches for digital equity. We're going to have the live meeting in Detroit, Michigan, at one of the churches there, and we will have people like Alejandro and others come in if they can make it to Detroit or other places. If not, we'll have them on film, and then we'll invite other people there to sort of get the message out to the churches. Get the message, because if you talk to a faith leader, you're not just talking to the faith leader. You're probably talking to 1,000 people. Right. So that's what we're trying to do. And yes, we will be going into rural communities. Like I said, we'll do something big in Detroit, but that will also be in rural Virginia, rural other states, down south particularly. And so that is a big concern of ours. You know, we want to help the people in the urban areas, but we also want to help the people in the rural areas, because the goal is that eventually we won't have to say there is a digital divide. We'll say that everyone has access and affordable access.
Well, your mention of Detroit reminds me that one of the biggest stories that I've heard over the last 3-4 years about digital discrimination was a 45-day outage in Detroit, right? And so I don't know whether that factors in too. Like we've talked about price, what about reliability of service and how that kind of, I mean, would a community, this was a community of color, would that type of outage be accepted in another type of community? That's part of the discussion, the dialogue that I hear on this topic. Catherine?
I think it also, sorry, I was about to jump down a rabbit hole on public utilities commissions and PSCs and outage policies, particularly in California. So I just went there anyway. I think though, what all of this emphasizes is we have made significant progress in drawing attention to the issue of the digital divide, explaining to lawmakers and partners what the digital divide is, and more importantly, what it means to our communities when folks don't have access to an affordable connection or the skills to use it. And then beyond that, how it looks among different groups within our communities. I think the point of all of this is that we need a more sophisticated approach, a more sophisticated national policy approach and state policy approach and local to the digital divide. We cannot solve this through a single program or through a single law. We have hit a point where we need to be more nuanced and we need a more sophisticated approach to solving the digital divide.
Alejandro, would you like to address this question of how how rurality, reliability, and outages are these part of your purview or not?
I mean, there's definitely a lot of teams that explore a lot of these issues. But I mean, as we're kind of wrapping up, because I want to be kind of sensitive to it, I started by acknowledging that bridging our country's digital divide is a team lift. And I think that I also want to acknowledge, because sometimes I feel like our ISP friends are sensitive to the fact that we don't say enough, that we have incredible internet infrastructure, as we saw during the global pandemic. Like when you compare our infrastructure to other parts of the world, like ours withstood the increase in traffic, the shift to online everything. But we know that we are at a point where that infrastructure has yet to reach or is not yet accessible to everyone everywhere. And that is, I think, why we're all leaning in, right?
Yeah. Well, let's go to, we got another question here.
Super quick.
Oh, please. We do have 2 questions online we want to get to, so quick.
Just a quick comment, just for the record, that 45-day outage in the Detroit area was not a cable broadband provider.
I couldn't remember who it was, and that's why I didn't say.
And I think that's
we were, yes.
Here's a question from Mike Neely. It's actually 2 questions. One, how are low-income programs, prices, and discounts not intentionally discriminatory based upon income? Okay, so maybe that's an economic geek question on price discrimination. And 2, is there any publicly available data regarding demand elasticity for broadband internet access services on pricing? Anyone want to weigh into those economic-related questions?
Sorry. On the demand elasticity point, I think we're starting to scratch the surface, but it's difficult to evaluate because of unbundled pricing. And it's not criticism, it's just a statement of fact. And so I think, again, it gets to the point of we need more data and transparency in order to better answer those questions and assess price tolerance, quite frankly.
I think that, we've looked at this too. And I mean, economists get PhDs doing this kind of stuff. So, but I believe that NCTA has done some work recently on demand elasticity for broadband. So I'd recommend the questioner take a look at that work.
Well, this is not a TPRC, Telecommunications Policy Research Conference, event, but I encourage you to go to that because there are lots and lots of discussions of that sort. We're trying to maybe bridge that gap with a really substantive paper and some great reactions. A question from Jim Mercanti. Interesting observations about availability. It would be interesting to also hear any observations about affordability, any insight and correlation between affordability and income, race, ethnicity, as well as surveys on what people say they can afford on speed, data, latency. Go ahead, Catherine.
Thanks for the immediate punt. If I could encourage you, Jim, to go to the Pew Research Center. My colleagues on the other side of the building do phenomenal research on those questions. Additionally, I would reach out to state offices of digital equity, as well as the broadband offices who have published quite a bit of that data in their 5-year action plans, as well as in their initial proposals, but most recently in their digital equity plans. I'm looking to my colleagues here to see if they have anything that they would like to add on those points.
Well, this by design, we haven't really talked about the Affordable Connectivity Program, but let's just maybe say a word or two on that here. What do we do to address this threat that is out there?
I think for one thing, we could get some funding for the
Well, we
program to
can't pass.
continue. Just
What
encourage
can
our
we do?
friends on the Hill. There's bipartisan support for this. There's bipartisan support for this among members, among voters. It's an election year. Let's get a win, folks.
Yeah.
But I think also continuing to remind lawmakers, ACP does not equal free. So we still have a median, households are paying a median of $40 a month, even on top of the ACP. That's not criticism, it's just a statement of fact. So the ACP is an important and necessary tool to make sure that folks can get online when those connections are available, and it helps create that complementarity for providers as they think about building out in the future. We need both tools together in order to close the digital divide.
We're going to give everyone a chance to offer closing remarks as we get towards the end. So let's actually, do you want to go?
I can
Robert, let's just Robert and go down the line and we'll
come back.
give Alejandro
Yeah, he gets the
final
last
thought.
word. He's FCC. Always gets the last word, I would say. Yeah, I want to let you know I appreciate being here. ACP is very, very important. We have been trying our hardest. We've been sending letters. We've been having people sign petitions to try to get it together. We've had meetings on the Hill. We've had meetings with people in the White House. If anyone in this room, if you haven't already, send a note. I mean, it's a last ditch effort, but it's still not impossible that the members will do it. We need to get the leadership. I mean, frankly, I think if it's put on the floor of the House or put on the floor of the Senate, I think it would pass. I may be wrong, but I think that's my feeling from the number of people who signed on board. I also learned an interesting fact that the state that has the most ACP recipients is a state with the Speaker of the House. So we need to encourage him to look out for his own constituents, and that's not a criticism of him. That's a reality check. Thank you.
Thank you.
I so value this conversation because I really appreciate actually, number one, focusing in on availability, because part of this is oftentimes we have these discussions and all of it blends together, right? And so we're not using common terms. I mean, even in this discussion, I know that even when we say access to broadband, well, what does access mean? Is that affordable or is that available, right? And so having these finer discussions, especially among sophisticated crowds, is so important. And then how do we explain that to our own community so that we're communicating that in an effective way, right? The last thing I would just say is to remember why this is so important, right? Look, just as electricity, just as utilities, just as sewage system is so important to everyday life, we are at a point that broadband service is so important to everyday life. And so if we are to function as a democracy, what are we all willing to put into that system, right? That's the fundamental question. And you could talk about sort of, and look, I will disclose, I'm from an organization that leans progressive, right? But I fully understand, like, to have the system work, we need capitalism as well. So how do we work together, recognizing that a rising tide lifts all boats? I get seasick, but I still use that analogy, right? But realistically, democracy requires all of us to come together. And that's what we need. I know ACP is hard. I'm not going to get into details about that. We have different funding ideas in play, but that's the theme I want all of us to remember.
Catherine.
I think I hit all my closing remarks earlier, but just thank you for the discussion. And I agree with everything that was just said, especially this point about looking at digital equity as the tide that raises all boats. Yeah, great. Okay, thanks. Yeah, okay. It's Wednesday. But I think also just thank you for bringing more data to the discussion. And thank you for providing the space to have these sophisticated discussions. the more the merrier when it comes to the data, because I think that's really going to be the only way that we deeply understand the challenges that we have ahead of us, but also the solutions that we have on the table too. So thank you.
Paul?
Well, yeah, I'd like to extend my thanks as well to NCTA for hosting this event at this really nice venue. And maybe we should call you Broadband Brunch, because it's, we're definitely beyond
Those who
breakfast.
are here will enjoy a broadband lunch, right?
Have a
after
broadband lunch. So thank you, Drew, for always being such a great moderator and MC for these kinds of activities and the great questions. And I also appreciate the questions from the audience as well as the questions that were submitted online. They all get me thinking, and I really appreciate that. And these issues are really important. We have a once in a lifetime opportunity to help to achieve internet for all. It's a huge amount of money, but it could be squandered if it's not done right. And so I think all of us are committed to really just figuring out how to get this problem solved in the right way, so that internet for all actually means internet for all. Everyone gets it. And then again, both on the focus of this paper is on availability, but adoption is also extremely important. We like to think that we're being objective and thorough in our paper, and sort of thinking of all the angles, but with humility, we don't get everything right. We don't think, the MDU question, that was a good one. There's definitely opportunities for further work and further research and drilling down on specific issues, like, for example, the Asian American issue and lower income areas is an area for potentially some further work, maybe unpacking the rurality piece a bit more. But I really appreciated this. I'm amazed by the caliber of the fellow panelists who've been willing to take time out of their day to share their thoughts with me and with this audience. So thank you so much. I've really appreciated it.
Well, before we thank our audience, we want to make sure Alejandro gives a final thoughts from our friends at the FCC.
Well, similarly, I think that I did my wrap-up thoughts earlier, but I really just want to say, it's clear that we are kind of navigating dynamic terrain, both literally and figuratively. So I think I would just kind of echo my appreciation for everybody in the room, tuning online, everybody at the community level, at the hyper-local level, who are leaning in and lending their voices, so that we can all ensure that, again, we get this right, because it's good for everyone. It's good for the economy, and I think it ensures that we have a competitive workforce, so that we can continue to raise up kind of American innovation here and abroad.
Very good. And I don't know if my clicker works pointing one way or the other. We have upcoming events of Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We're going to be with our friends at Next Century City next week. So another live event from 9 till 4. The following week, we'll be back to our normal online only, 12 noon. We're talking about amnesty and the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. And then the week following, we kick off a series of events on smart cities, with one on education and smart cities. On behalf of our friends here at NCTA and each of our panelists, Alejandro, Robert, John, Catherine, and Paul, I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast, and we'll see you next week. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for taking time both last night and